Hey guys, I thought I would do another video blog. It's been a while since I did one. And, well, this is going to be a topic I've thought about doing for a while, but I wasn't sure what the reaction would be, so I kind of been on the fence. But, given my two recent lengthy projects, it seems like as good a time as any. And that is kind of separating the facts from the myths with regards to Predicta TVs. Now, some of what I'm about to say I know for sure. Some of it is pure speculation, and some of it is I don't know. Let's start out with, well, what's a Predicta TV? There's one of them over there, and there's one of them right down here. These are the swivel screen TVs. For the most part. As one of my viewers pointed out, who is an avid collector, there are the other Predictas, the oddball Predictas that do not have swivel screens, like the full dress version, Miss America set. They're in the same family. If you were to get a brochure from back then that said Predicta, there would be 20 sets or so on it. But the classic ones, the ones people think of, they're the 21-inch sets. Basically, the very first one was the Holiday, and that's the one you see me working on, the moldy one that came out of a museum. Along with that was the Tandem. That's 21-inch with the long 25-foot cable. Then there's also the 21-inch barber pole, also known as the pedestal, I think is the official name for it. That's where it's vertically mounted chassis and the swivel screens on top of that. And then there is the Continental, which is the very last one. It's a 21-inch set, somewhat similar to the pedestal, but a more Danish modern cabinet and a more refined chassis. It's got a power transformer. It's basically the 17-inch version chassis with a redesigned picture tube. Get to that in a moment. And the 17-inch sets. There's a Siesta, that's the one that has a clock in it. These are the metal cabinet ones. Metal cabinet, rectangular, that's the one that I just showed you down here. And the Princess, I think all the Siestas only came in gold. Then there's the Princess, which came in vermilion, aka red, beige, and dark brown, or they called it mahogany. And then there's the Debutante, which is the most basic version, does not have any arms on the swivel screen, and has a cloth front rather than a metal grill. Alright, so, for starters, the Predictas had some design flaws. There were a lot of returns. Absolutely true. However, that did not bankrupt Philco. Philco was a massive company. Yes, they did go bankrupt right at the height of the Predictas, around 60, 61. However, that was a minuscule part of the Philco Corporation. What a lot of people didn't know, including myself until pretty recently, is they were heavily involved in semiconductors. I knew that they were pioneering in transistors because they had the world's first all-transistor TV, the Safari, the little portable guy with the visor screen on it. All the transistors inside, they designed and built themselves in their own fab. They also went on throughout the 60s to make integrated circuits. They made computers. They made part of mission control for the space program. They were a big aerospace contractor. And then, of course, they did a ton of radios, but they also did a lot of appliances, and apparently that's part of what got them into trouble. Part of it was spending a fortune on semiconductor research and fab, and I mean, imagine starting from scratch and making your own facility to make transistors and integrated circuits, the kind of investment that would take, versus having a few TVs returned because they needed picture tubes replaced. It's not quite on the same scale. But appliances apparently got them into some trouble too, where they were branching out. Refrigerators, I imagine some of you know about, because those are somewhat collectible now, but they were getting into some other stuff too, I think, like air conditioning and so on. There's a pretty good technical write-up on what happened to them and why they went bankrupt. I'll try to dig it up and include a link to it. But also, as I'm sure many of you know, Ford bought them, or bought them out, or worked out some kind of arrangement. So Philco Ford continued to exist for many years, where they made car radios and continued to make TVs into the 60s. And they continued to be a contractor and work on semiconductors and so on. And I think some fragments of Philco might even still exist because they were also in South America. So, there's that. So what were the design flaws? Absolutely, the 21-inch picture tube had a very short life. The emissions would drop off quite quickly. Picture tubes were rapidly shrinking throughout the 50s, and were getting shorter and shorter. So how do you shrink one? You increase the deflection angle. So early picture tubes were like crazy. I mean, like 40 degrees or something. And then the standard 10, 12-inch in the late 40s were 53-inch, I believe. Then for a long time we had 70, and then 90, and then finally by the time we get to the Predictas, they're 110 or so. But you still got the neck sticking out. So the big innovation with the Predictas wasn't so much a deflection angle, because there were a number of picture tubes that were at that 110 degree point by then. It was making the electron gun go from being that long to like that long. That's where they got into trouble, because they had to really shrink the cathode. And I think they rotated at 90 degrees as well. In the end, I don't think there was a whole lot of emittive surface left for the cathode, and they did not last very long. It didn't take them long to fix the problem, though, because within a year or so, there were several others that were out that were basically the same dimensions that did not have that problem. So that's why it was a shame when the last model at Danish Modern came out. I think it had a 21 EVP4 picture tube. So basically, within a year or two, they'd worked out all the kinks, then they went bankrupt. So if that hadn't happened, who knows? They might have been a big success. The other big design flaw, or one of the other big design flaws, was the power switch. Push on, push off. All the models had the same power switch. They all had the same problem. They failed prematurely. Those are by far and away the two biggest design issues. Premature death of the 21-inch picture tube and flaky on-off power switch. All the other stuff I consider to be minor. We'll get into that in a bit. But even so, look how many of them there are around. It is, I would say, definitely the most common vintage TV. They must have made, not only must they have made thousands and thousands and thousands of them, but many and many of them were saved, I presume because of the way they looked. And I'm sure a lot of people hung on to them just for decoration. Because they made millions and millions of other TVs, but they're all long gone because they were just big, ugly, boxy things, especially in the 50s, when it was all about screen size and cabinets. Went from being fine, exotic veneers to particle board, basically, and faux finishes. So basically just a big box with a picture tube in it, so not something you'd really want to hang around once they stop working. And you've seen how many I've picked up without really even trying. Sure, it helps them in a major metro area, but I don't go out of my way to find them. They just kind of show up periodically. Oh, yes. I'd be remiss. There is one other major issue, which I'm sure was not a problem back then. But keep in mind, these sets are now 60 years old. That is the screen cover on the 21-inch models, which is made out of tenite, which is a butyrate, I forget the butyric acetate, something like that. Basically, it's made from cellulose, which is derived from wood fiber, and butyric acid and some type of ester, and make a resin out of it, and thermoset it into a mold. Two problems with it. Well, let's first off, why did they use it? So Eastman Kodak invented the stuff. It's a really, really tough, durable plastic that's got some give to it. They wanted the picture tube to be outside the cabinet and be able to be swiveled. Cool, but you got to protect people. Picture tubes, if they get whacked hard enough, implode and send glass shards flying. They did not have bonded safety glass or anything like that back then. It was just a glass jug that would send glass everywhere. They needed something really tough, really durable to encase it in. That is optically clear. That's why they used it. Yeah, it's got a bit of a tinge to it, which may or may not have been intentional. I'm not sure about. So at the time, it was a really cool material, and it was a good design choice. But decades later, the stuff starts, well, decaying. In the past, I got to correct myself. In the past, I said it was not mold, because I'd see people in the forums posting, "No, it's mold," and I'd say, "No, it's the plastic decomposing on its own, just a chemical process." But no, it's both, unfortunately. I mean, anything made from organic material can rot. So yes, given the right environment and spores, yes, they do get moldy. But also, as anybody who's had old screwdrivers know, that they smell. It's the butyric acid. Well, the plastic decomposing releases a gas that smells, well, like vomit, basically. What can you do about it? I've heard many things proposed. From my own experience having them stored in various places, keeping the humidity down and the temperature down seems to help a lot. As far as coating it with stuff, I'm not sure. I just try to keep them, clean them off occasionally, and that's about it. The 17-inch models do not have this problem. These are a different kind of plastic. I think it's some type of plexiglass or acrylic. They're more fragile, they're more brittle. In fact, most of mine have cracks in them, but they have zero odor. Now, I don't think anything I just said is too controversial, other than whether or not it caused the demise of Philco. I'm sure the dealerships were not happy about it, but again, it was a fraction of the company's business. I'm sure they could have absorbed the losses, worked out the kinks on the model, and salvaged some type of reputation and kept going, if it wasn't for their massive expenditures in other areas. All right, so where it gets a little more controversial is what hobbyists and collectors think now about Predictas, in particular their design. Let's take a step back a little bit. This was definitely an evolution. If you were to look at a Philco from a year, 2, 3, 4 years earlier, you would see some similar components like this IF box and tuner. The difference with this is how they took these pieces from more conventional models and rearranged them to fit them into the cabinet. So in the 21-inch model, they kind of made it a rectangular layout like this. In the 17-inch models, they stretched it out more, and they rotated this way and made it skinnier and wider, but very similar components. So a couple things about this. Yes, it's a bit different if you don't have a lot of experience working on TVs from this era. People complain all the time about, like, what were they thinking with the wire wrap? So most of the circuitry, especially in the 17-inch models, this is the 21-inch model, a lot of the circuitry is on this circuit board. Then there's some other parts underneath the chassis. In the 17-inch model, almost all of it's on the main board. They are secured down and then with the stakes sort of bent up on the chassis, and they go through the circuit board and they're bent over, and they use wire wrap on these stakes. So when this is mounted down, they have steel covering it. You can't get at the board. They called these perma-circuit modules. I think their intent back in the day was they wouldn't need to be serviced. Or the set, you can call planned obsolescence. By the time anything on this went bad, get them to buy a new TV. Whether that, was part of the sales, marketing idea from the beginning, that I don't know. I have no idea. but it's a possibility. However, if you have worked on other brands from this era, for example, we've got a GE hiding over here. This has almost the same type of construction. In fact, it's worse. This is a 59 or 58 actually. General Electric with a 21-inch short picture tube. It's some of the same design features that the Predictas have, and other manufacturers did similar. Also has circuit boards, also wire wrap, also extremely difficult to get out and service. There is nothing unique about using circuit boards that cannot be serviced while they're in the set, that use wire wrap wires that are very hard to get out. Other manufacturers are doing it too. There's some RCAs that are really a pain in the ass to work on too. That being said, I think these are actually some of the easier sets to work on once you kind of wrap your head around the concepts and where the parts are located, and forget about how other earlier sets were that you may be used to. Because it's not that hard to get these out once you get the hang of it. And once you do, replace everything on this board and you're practically done. And with the 17-inch models, you're really just about done. Because there's only a few other parts on the chassis. And I find it much easier to work on a small circuit board on the workbench than have a huge chassis with like a picture tube mounted on it and so on that you have to kind of struggle around. Now, that's my personal thought. I have no issues with working on circuit boards. Sure, if you make a mistake and you wire it back in, that can be a pain. And it's easy to say, well, don't make a mistake. Of course you make mistakes. I've made mistakes. I've had to take the boards back out. But every wire is a different color. Look at some reference photos. The Service Info is very good about what wires go where. It's laid out fairly logically. I think it's pretty straightforward to work on. So there's that. Yes, some of the way the things are arranged, it's a little different. I don't think it's necessarily bad design. I've got several that work on basically all their original parts. Alright, so another big issue I hear all the time, I've been asked about several times, I've seen people discuss it many times, is heat. I've heard people say these sets run hot. I saw somebody on Facebook a few months ago post a thermal image they took of a 17-inch set, and they said, "Oh, look at the bright spots, it runs so hot." And I said, well, what do you mean? What does running hot even mean? He says, well, look, this one, the area over the horizontal output tube, it's 300 degrees or something like that. And my comment was, and how hot is it supposed to be? And he didn't have an answer for it. If anything, these sets actually run cooler. The 17-inch model, I just looked it up, I think it consumes 175 watts. That is pretty modest for a vintage TV. I'll give you an extreme opposite example. The first main ship TV that RCA put out, the RCA 630TS, had 30 tubes in it, including 2 5U4 rectifiers. There's 30 watts just in the filaments on 2 tubes. The whole set draws over 350 watts, as memory serves. And there are other vintage sets, especially combo sets, that draw over 400 watts, 500 watts. 175 is nothing. There are only a handful of tubes in these. And as far as the power consumption on a vintage TV, 95+% of it, 99% of it is going to be heat. A minuscule amount of the power consumed ends up being visible light, a minuscule amount ends up being sound, and a minuscule amount is used in the pilot lights. The rest of it is just all waste heat, primarily the tube filaments. So 21-inch set, 0.6 amps through the tube filaments. So with 117 volts, 0.6 amps, that's 65, 70 watts just to light up the tubes, nothing else. So does every other TV made back then. In fact, most of them had more tubes than this, so they'd generate even more waste heat. So, and the tubes they use are common tubes used in many sets. So the tubes themselves are not running any hotter filament-wise. So what other way could a tube run hot? If you bias it so that it's drawing a lot of current, like near the design limit, like nearly red plating on a power tube, they weren't. There's nothing extreme about any of the way they were using the tubes. And then a little gets burned up in resistors. I think what throws people off is, especially in the 17-inch sets, where that's where I most commonly hear about, oh, they get so hot. First off, the cabinet's like Swiss cheese. There's vent holes all over the place, and the tubes are right under it. More conventional TVs, like that big boxy Admiral back there, there's like a good foot between the cabinet and the tubes. Something like this, there's only maybe an inch or two. So, this is just my thinking, is that a lot more heat gets transferred to the cabinet from the tubes because there's less surrounding air for any kind of cushion or circulation. And the cabinet essentially acts as a heat sink. So yes, the cabinet is hotter than in other TVs. Or a wooden cabinet, the cabinet's actually kind of insulating it. But if you were to actually measure the temperature of the tube, it's not going to be any difference. So they do not consume any more power. In fact, they probably consume less power than most comparable TVs. And the tubes are not running any hotter. I think you just feel the heat more. And no, I don't think you need to add cooling fans to them. There's already tons of vent holes, and I've never seen any issue about, sometimes the circuit boards discolor. They're 60 years old. But other than that, no, I don't think there's any issue with them getting too hot or overheating or anything like that. There are a few other issues I'd like to briefly touch on. One being the 9-pin sockets used in the 21-inch models, especially the early ones. They can develop metal fatigue in those bent over pieces of metal there and break. So while you've got the board out, you should examine those and replace them if they look suspect. Then there's the cup plates. Many manufacturers were using cup plates by then. It's like a hybrid module with multiple resistors and capacitors on one substrate to save production time. Especially vertical integrators, it was pretty common by then to use them. That's what this guy is. So there's several resistors and capacitors in there as well. It's not too difficult to make replicas yourself. Reproductions are now available, and it's not unheard of for the originals to be just fine, or within spec well enough that they work without you having to bother with them. And the circuit boards, they're phenolic boards, and yes, the copper foils can lift off them. Same with everybody else that was using circuit boards back then. Use a lower wattage soldering iron, keep the temperature down, and don't stress the leads. And as far as like it being darkened around the tubes, tubes get hot, that's what happens. Not a big deal. Another thought that's occurred to me from reading through various restoration attempts online and hearing about the troubles people have had in trying to get them working is, one, they'd heard all the rumors about the sets and immediately assumed the worst before they even got started. And two, it seems like oftentimes they have little to no experience working on vintage TVs. Maybe they've worked on a few amplifiers, a few radios, and they got a Predicta because they thought they were cool. And they dive into it and they're immediately frustrated and think, oh yeah, wow, these are a horrible design, they are cheaply made, they're pieces of junk, and they abandon the project. One of the first TVs I ever got was a Predicta. And luckily I found some forums and got some advice, and before I had gotten very deep into it, I stopped. And I worked on some other TVs for a few years and got some experience, then went back to it, and I was successful. And it didn't seem anywhere near as daunting or as intimidating as it had when I first got the TV. So my advice to anybody who has one or is thinking about getting one, do your homework. read through some of the restoration write-ups online, watch some videos, familiarize yourself with potential issues, how it was designed, why it was designed, where the parts are, and how to take the things apart and put them back together and all that good stuff. And I think you'll be a lot more successful. And I'm not saying any of this because I'm trying to be a Philco Predicta apologist. I have no stake in it. I don't have any relatives that had worked for them or anything like that. These are just my opinions, my observations from a decade plus of tinkering around with them and being involved in the hobby pretty actively. I hope this sparks some lively conversation. I look forward to your comments. That's all for now. Bye.